to this first session of Brand Square for 2013. Happy New Year to all of you, and thank you for joining me. I'm Kathy Onetto. I'm Vice President of Brand Strategy with Anthem Worldwide, and I'm here to share with you some findings from our latest Sightings report, which is a forecast issue. And we're going to be talking about the idea of inflection point and where 2013 will take us. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Sightings, Sightings is an Anthem quarterly publication that offers inspiring observations from around the globe. And what we tend to cover are trends in marketing, innovation, branding, and design. We also use this Sightings process with some of our clients. It's an approach that we apply to a brand, a category, or to products to guide strategic decisions. So with that as background, let's go ahead and jump into talking about 2013 and what we predict will be taking place in this coming year. So as we were starting to think about this, and frankly, all throughout last year, myself and my team, we were talking about kind of what's happening even within the context of last year, and what do we see in terms of trends and the sentiment and what have you. And as we looked back and started to think about our forecast issue and starting to develop, the sightings for this issue, we looked back at 2012 and we realized 2012 was really an eventful, very full year around the globe. And I think others who have been reporting on 2012 and starting to forecast around 2013 have said similar things. So you had a lot of political and economic changes happening, from the US presidential election to other elections around the globe, to the political leader in China changing, to the Middle East, these young democracies going through continued change. You had a number of global celebrations, from the Queen's Diamond Jubilee to even the London Olympics happening in the same country. You had a bunch of scientific phenomena and discoveries. Just so, and if any of you are concerned or want to know this, the last solar transit of Venus happened this past year, and it's not going to happen again until 2117. So a number of different things on the scientific realm as well. And then you had these continued consequences and impacts of the Great Recession still happening. And yet it was almost as if what we were feeling was that attitudes and movements started to get into this neutral zone. It was almost as if they were awaiting decisions to be made and these events to subside to almost determine what our future trajectory is going to be. And that's what we kind of are feeling is going to happen to some degree in 2013. We feel that what's happening right now is there's a bunch of polarity even outside of the US political system, but there are dueling choices really kind of taking shape in the world. And we think that 2013 is going to start to help us root that out and perhaps put us into a new equilibrium, a new balance that we're suggesting is richer, simpler, and smarter. And you're going to see this idea of richer, simpler, and smarter show up in the sightings I'm going to share with you. And I'll speak to that a little bit more as we start to go through those. So when we framed our sightings, they really exist at this intersection of macro trends that we're seeing happening in the marketplace with these consumer and shopper trends and counter trends that we're seeing happening in the marketplace. So I'm going to start by sharing some macro trends with you. I'm going to also then cover at a high level these consumer and shopper trends and counter trends. And again, it was these and at the intersection of these that we then identified 10 sightings. Today I'm only going to share 5 of them with you. We don't have enough time to go through all of them, but you're welcome to download, and I'll provide a link at the end of the presentation. You're welcome to download the sightings report so you can get all of the details, because I'm not going to be able to cover everything in this talk today that's covered in the sightings report. So let me go ahead and jump into these macro trends that we believe are framing 2013 and what we're going to be seeing. And there are 5 that we focused on that you're seeing up on the screen here. And really, they all link to this idea of just a tremendous amount of change that's happening in the marketplace. So and I'll go into each of these a little bit more, but we have a changing landscape, this idea of just broad dynamic change that's really impacting business. You have a changing culture, and I'm going to talk about this give it to me now culture that's happening. You have changing business models and this idea of mainstream entrepreneur. You have changing retail landscape with battle of brick and mortar versus digital. And finally, you have changing content and communication platforms, which I'll cover in digital and data expansion. There's just a lot of dynamic change happening in the marketplace that businesses and brands need to navigate through. So I'll start with broad dynamic change. You know, what we're seeing in the marketplace, I mean, I just find that for businesses and for brands, there's so much happening right now that you really need to navigate through. There's people shifting, there's consumption and shopping patterns. There's a marketing toolkit that continues to change on us. And all of that is happening with continued cost of goods pressures that need to be managed through. The world's moving at breakneck speed, and at the same time, you also have this changing consumer demographic. And that's not just happening in the United States, that's happening around the globe as well. You have differing views now around how do we, if I'm a global brand, how do I manage that? What's appropriate? Is it global, local, or local? You know, there's debate around that. And then there's also what we find, and we found just throughout last year, this continuing instability that seems to be caused by these various exposés that seem to be happening all around the world. And it's because of these digital technologies, perhaps, that is starting to root out some of these various exposés. But to us, in this world of broad dynamic change, it's almost as if the only thing that's going to remain constant is the fact that consumers continue to be a little bit skeptical about institutions. Then you have this changing culture that's happening, this idea of a give it to me now culture. So consumers are just ever more impatient, expecting more with no time to waste. And that expectation is really around this ante of real time. And it's because everyone is always on all the time. I don't know about you, but you know, there's research around millennials, the fact that they sleep with their phones, with their smartphones often, and it's not uncommon supposedly for them to wake up in the middle of the night actually and be texting with people. Now, I think many of us older folks also sleep with our iPhones and aren't willing to admit we check our email first thing in the morning, but I'm certainly not texting in the middle of the night. But regardless, despite all of this give it to me now culture, what you're finding, or because of it, I should say rather, people are really looking to cut through the clutter. Then there's this idea of mainstream entrepreneur. What we feel is that this entrepreneurial mindset is becoming much more mainstream. You know, if you go and you look at the definition of entrepreneur, I was hard pressed to find a definition that does not say an entrepreneur is one who is willing to take on more than unusual risk. And yet what we are finding is that this entrepreneurial spirit is really booming around the globe. It's not just happening here in San Francisco where I am, where frankly I feel like it's been having a revival over the last year, but it's happening all around the globe, from Des Moines here in the United States to Berlin to China to even in Afghanistan. And part of the reason why we think that's happening is because there really are more tools and services available to people to help them become those entrepreneurs, and to do so in a slightly different and less risky landscape. Now, we think that this will continue to impact business in general, given these types of mainstream entrepreneurs that are starting to create businesses on their own. The next, in terms of the retail landscape, I think it's pretty apparent that the retail landscape is being redefined. And I think our key point here is that it's not just battle of brick and mortar versus digital. Certainly this is the case. And I think it's interesting from my perspective, this idea too of what's happening here in terms of big box stores, and the fact that I think what you're going to see is some of these shutting down because they just aren't needed anymore. And a tangential thing that's related to that I think may happen is, instead of urban blight happening, what you might start to see is actually suburban blight, with all these large big box retail establishments becoming empty. But with that said, just think about the fact that the reality is shopping models are continuing to change. There's ever increasing new models, especially given the digital environment, that is really shaping how consumers are shopping. And then finally, digital and data expansion. If you haven't seen an article about big data this year, then certainly seek one out. I'd be surprised if you haven't. But with all of our communication vehicles and content changing and becoming much more digital, it's all in the cloud, and there's all of this data that people are using and have access to. And I think people may be surprised to find out what all the different things that are being used, how that data is being used. And I think within the last year, you're starting starting to see people, and I think it's going to continue to emerge, a little bit more scrutiny around these areas. So those were the macro trends. I'm going to go through these consumer and shopper trends and counter trends a little more quickly, but there were 5 areas around consumer and shopper trends and counter trends that we looked at. And this is all around really the framing of consumers and shoppers, and I'll say a little bit more about each of those as we go through. You know, it's not uncommon within trends that you have this polarity, that you have this trend and counter trend, and they're existing at the same time in the marketplace. So the first one I'll talk about is really around who consumers are. So you have this youthfulness that's happening out in the world, balanced with older and wiser. And so despite the fact that there is a high degree of unemployment with the youth, that youthful spirit is very much has very much been impacting our world, from creating movements to getting companies to stop doing certain things to creating businesses. So you take someone like Camila Vallejo, who's 24 years old, down in Chile, whose picture is on the screen, who has started a movement around education down in Chile. You take someone like 22-year-old Molly Kochpol, who last year stopped Bank of America from instituting bank fees. So these young people are really impacting the world despite the fact that they may have high unemployment. And while all of us may want that youthful spirit, really out in the marketplaces, you're also seeing the power of those boomers and older and wiser, and that's around the globe. And interestingly, from my standpoint, as I look at this, really what's powerful there is that, you know, the people who are older and wiser, they are wiser. They kind of, while we want that youthful spirit, these are the guys that know how to shrug things off and actually how to experience that youthful spirit in the world, or in their daily lives, I should say. So these are things that are counteracting. The next one is around how these consumers behave and shoppers behave. So on the one hand, you are seeing consumers who are highly engaged. I might say that we might be living in a world where we have the most engaged consumers with brands than we ever have had. You also have these folks who are very informed from a shopping perspective. There's so much information that they take in and investigate and research, from reviews to data and suggestions and recommendations. And you balance that with the impact of something like Twitter, where you actually have a lot of consumers that are practicing the art of skimming, right? I only read the headlines, just give me the short and sweet of it. So those two, going deeper versus actually the art of skimming, are also, both of those are taking shape in the world. The next one is around how consumers think, and it's this idea of global versus local. So, you know, over the last decade, we've had this global culture that's really developed based on, you know, global media, based on more global travel, global trade, all of these factors. And really, researchers or academics have shown that whether or not someone takes a global perspective versus a local perspective is really based on their attitudes and their beliefs, their belief system. And so on the contrast, while you have some people that really do take a global perspective and global view, you have on the other where people are taking more of a local perspective as well. The next one is around how these consumers feel. So on the one hand, there's been a lot of documentation around the fact that though we have all these technologies and we have, you know, 1,000 Facebook friends or however many people you're connected on with LinkedIn, that really there is this loss of human connection that's happening in the marketplace. So there is this idea of being alone together, if you will. And then you contrast that with what we're seeing in the marketplace, this idea of lowered human and consumer barriers. I mean, whoever thought that something like Airbnb would be so successful around the globe, where you have people who are willing to go and stay in somebody else's home, a stranger's home, even with that stranger living there, not knowing, is the room going to be clean, you know, is it going to be safe? And yet, you know, almost because we're willing to share so much about us, you see this lowered human and consumer barriers. There's another example too in the UK of a company called Zopa that is a way for people to get loans from other individuals, not a bank. So, I mean, it's just very interesting that despite the fact that there's also this loss of human connection, it's almost as if we're more open together with each other, if you will. And then finally, the final one is around what these consumers want. And this is around do more for me versus create myself. People are so busy that they love it when brands, businesses offer them solutions. Just solve this for me. In contrast, there's really something happening in the world around this idea of a maker economy. And this is something that Chris Anderson, the editor-in-chief of Wired Magazine, really champions. And that people, because of new technologies available, he really talks about this idea of manufacturing democratization. And if you haven't heard about 3D printers, it's something that's been in the news. We reported on it actually last year in our last forecast, but it's continuing to get exposure, and this idea of the fact that you yourself can create items. And this is also impacting and driving part of that mainstream entrepreneur that we're seeing as well. One thing I just want to say before I move on to the sightings and get to each of those is that we tested all of these trends and counter trends in a quantitative study, and we tested that in the US, in the UK, and in China. And so if you're interested in seeing those results, that's in the sightings report, and I encourage you to go and download it. It was really very interesting to see the results and what we thought and what people thought around the globe in terms of which of these trend or counter trends they thought were going to be more prominent in 2013. So with that, let's move on to some of the sightings. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to go through all 10. I'm going to cover 5 here. And the first one is Brands for Life. And this is really in the context of creating a richer it kind of falls into that richer camp of 2013. And sometimes these things are going to overlap in terms of some of them will cover richer and simpler and what have you. But at any rate, Brands for Life is really about this idea of deepening consumer brand relationships. So as I mentioned at the beginning in terms of one of the macro trends, that today's cultural environment is one in which trust still needs to be earned, right? And a lot of consumers still have a lot of skepticism about institutions. And then you marry this with the fact that there's this loss of human connection, and it almost seems implausible, but brands really have an opportunity to kind of step into that void. And what we're starting to see are some brands that are starting to provide solutions and demonstrating how they can almost be like that trusted partner for consumers throughout their lifetime. So one example is Subaru. They have a current ad called Best Friend, where they talk about how one of their products can really be with you throughout your lifetime, through all the different stages in your life. Another one is Google Chrome. There's a great ad, if you haven't seen it, actually from last year. And Google Chrome has been using this kind of selling story in their advertising for the last couple of years. But there was a beautiful ad called Sophie that they did, where it demonstrates a real life story of a gentleman who used Google's digital toolkit, if you will, to chronicle the early years of his daughter's life. So how you can actually be there to capture those special moments within a person's life. And then the final one to use as an example is Wells Fargo, where they've had a campaign called Together We'll Go Far. And what they talk about is, again, how they can be there at these critical times in one's life to kind of provide that counsel, to provide that support, to help you through those most important points in the different stages of your life. And then they're also shifting or using this, I shouldn't say shift, but are using this message as well with small businesses. Again, how we can be your trusted partner through critical times in driving your business. So what this means for brands today is really that you do have an opportunity to go beyond the typical kind of product functional benefits as well as the associated emotional benefits to really continue to ladder up to this idea of trust, reliability, and support, really building bonds with these consumers for a lifetime. The next sighting is around innovation ecosystems, and this is around this idea of building better solutions together. And it really kind of borrows from this idea that Steven Johnson in his book, Where Good Ideas Come From, kind of articulates, which is that, oftentimes good ideas and inventions or innovations sometimes can't happen until another innovation has taken place. And I think what you're seeing in the marketplace are a lot more companies who are actually building businesses on top of other businesses' platforms. So one really simple example of this is Apple and all of the apps that are available, right, for the iPhone or for the iPad and what have you. But a couple of other examples of this are, one, Instagram. So Instagram has not yet made money. However, there are a lot of businesses that actually have made money off of Instagram. And I think Instagram is trying to start to figure that out for themselves. But an example of that is Printstagram, which allows you to, or helps you print things using your Instagram photos. Or there are consulting firms that are making money off of helping brands figure out how to use Instagram. Another example of this is Lunatic. If you aren't familiar with this, this was a Kickstarter project a year or two ago where these guys created a watch using the Apple iPod Nano. You're going to see a lot of examples here using Apple. But this is another example of a brand and a company really building on someone else's platform and creating products using what has been provided. Another example of this is Skype, which actually just launched a product at the end of last year for small businesses. That's called Skype in the Workplace. And it's all created with the intent of being able to help facilitate other small businesses, what their businesses are. So there are these integrated innovation ecosystems that are starting to take shape and take form. And we think this is really powerful, this richer environment of innovation. And what it means for marketers is that, it's so, while there has been open innovation before where you can share technologies and what have you, but there's it's almost taking this another level where you can build upon other people's products, businesses, and what have you. And I think while it's often the case where you think you need to be insular and keep things protected within a company, it's almost enlightening or freeing, if you will, that perhaps you don't have to go it alone, that perhaps some large innovations might come from actually being able to build upon someone else's business or technology or innovation. The next one is get to the point branding. So this is around the whole idea of simplicity and this idea of brand names as sound bites. So as I talked about earlier, consumers are skimming these days. They need a quick read. And what we're starting to see is some brands and new brands coming to the market that are catching on to this, and so really trying to build quick awareness as well as and do so in a way where they're encapsulating their key message into their brand name. And so you see a couple of examples of this up on the screen. This brand Help, that very quickly, right? We can help. Here are the ways that we can help. You have another one in the bottom left, Good Food Made Simple, where they really talk about their brand name on their website as being their commitment to what you can expect from these products. So very direct, very simple. So what does this mean for marketers? If you're a new brand, maybe the naming challenge doesn't have to be so difficult. Perhaps it's just rooted in what your beliefs are or directly what your key proposition is. For other brands where you're not going to change your brand name, what I would say is what this really means is for any of your communication, really think about how you can make it simpler for your consumers. Along the same vein is this idea of minimalist design. We think that this is going to continue to be a trend this year and really continue to take shape. And this, for us, goes beyond the simplicity of design that kind of Apple has shown. This really is about this idea of when design, when less really actually does mean more. And when you can kind of look at the examples up on the screen, this nature paint, just very simply with its iconography and its logo and identity that very quickly communicates its message. Or the Food Doctor and Apple Day, right? Very simple design, very clearly communicating what its intent is. And I think what this means for marketers is that it's just, hey, I was a marketer myself too. I've created packaging myself for my own brand and business, and it's very difficult sometimes to be choiceful about what you think you need to put on a package. But what this is really about is the fact that minimalist design done well and done right can really create those intuitive responses you're trying to get from the consumer that you want the consumer to have at point of decision. So it's really how can you tell your story in as simple and a consumable a way possible, really leveraging the design and copy to drive that purchase and build affinity as quickly and simply as possible. And then our final sightings is right place, right price, right place, right time. And this is really around simply closing the sale. And this is really a combination of like living in that world of smarter and simpler. And what we're finding is that retailers are optimizing their product offers and really trying to take away barriers to purchase. So from offline to online, what you're seeing are retailers are using technologies to offer shoppers the right product so that it's targeted at the right price, the best value, at the right place, online convenience or in-store, and at the right time immediately. And some examples of this are eBay Now. So here's a service that's being tested in San Francisco and New York where you can actually, on an app, order a product from a local store and these guys will courier it to you. So you don't have to wait for it to be shipped next day. They'll come and bring it to you right then where you want it. You have retailers such as Nordstrom and JCPenney who are doing the handheld purchasing such that, you know, there's no time in between where you might reconsider your purchase. It's done right then, so you can feel confident in your purchase and not start to question it. And then you also have this technology called Icy. It's a little creepy actually, but it's a mannequin that has facial recognition and it can track both traffic in a store, it can track the type of consumers you have walking through your store so that, again, you can optimize what's happening in the retail environment to really help close the sale. And while it seems a little maybe Machiavellian, perhaps, I don't know, or a little Big Brother, really the whole intent is how can you give the consumer or the shopper confidence in that time of selection? That's really what they're seeking. And even for them, we think that by simply closing the sale, it's good for brands, but it's also good for shoppers. So those are the 5 I was going to cover. The other 5 that are in the report that also talk to richer, simpler, and smarter are fusion culture, help me simplify, redefine cultural symbols, smarter health, and hidden costs of the digital age. So if you download the report, you can find those additional sightings covered. Up on the screen here is the link to where you can download the issue. It's on the Shock Knowledge Center, and you can look under white papers. And I'm happy to answer any questions now, as well as via email. If you want to send me an email or have any questions about what I've presented today, or are interested in sightings, my email there, kathy.onetto@anthemww.com, is up on the screen. So I know I went a little long here, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have in the couple minutes we have left here. I know I went through that fairly quickly. All right, so one question that I have here is there some advice you can give a marketer to get comfortable with minimalist design? You know, one thought here, and I'd almost encourage a design firm such as ours and others to do this with their clients, but, you know, really almost like take your design and start stripping things away and really see if, and it's usually with communication as opposed to design elements, but really see whether or not you're missing anything as you do that. You know, an interesting exercise is to do that with iconic brands when you start to realize like all you need to understand that it's Tiffany's is the color blue, or all you need to understand that it's Marlboro is the white and red in the shape of its design. So I would suggest that you go through the exercise of almost going through that simplification and seeing whether or not you're really missing anything. And I think it's, you know, one of the things that I find interesting is when you see things that are simple, you know, it's often that you're like, oh my gosh, that's so brilliant because it is so simple. So really challenge yourself to kind of strip away and see if you can get down to those nuggets that make you feel a little bit more comfortable. Is there any other questions? So one of the questions here is, one of the themes in your presentation was simplification. What if my product or brand requires me to educate and provide detail? How would you suggest I go about achieving that given this trend? So one thought here is, you know, there was a beautiful example of this actually around this idea of a smartphone. But even think about for those of you that have Apple products, you know, even if you need to educate the thing here is, how do you educate in the most simple way possible? And there was a great example from a UK design firm that created this out-of-box experience for a smartphone that was just so simple. We reported on it in a sightings last year, where it was almost like you opened a book, and each time you flipped the page, each page took you through the next step of what the process was to get your phone actually linked up and started. So you can still educate. The thing here is consumers can only take in so much, and they're not going to read detailed manuals. So how do you make that education process as simple as possible? Any final questions? Okay, maybe this will be our last one. With regard to simply closing the sale, you talked about retailers. Does this apply to manufacturers at all? I would absolutely say yes. So, you know, the thing here is you may not have the same toolkit, but for marketers, you know, the thing here is how do you, what is in your toolkit to help simply close the sale? So when I think about this, it's one, let's start with your package. Secondly, what can you do from a shelving recommendation standpoint, working with your retailers to help close the sale there as well? There's a lot of opportunity there. So it's those things. What is in your toolkit that you have available to help you simply close the sale from design architecture through to the shelf? So thank you so much. I know I'm a little bit out of time here. Maybe I'll just quickly, is minimalist design real for the global market? You know, that's a really great question. I almost want to follow up with you, and if you send me an email, because I think I'd like to get folks from our team in China to be able to address that for you. I'd love to get their perspective on what they think, how that applies. So if you send me an email, the individual who is asking that question, I'd be happy to forward it on and get back to you with a proper response that I can do more justice to in this last minute that we have here. So thank you everyone for joining me today. Really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great 2013.